Hey Ottawa, this is your Monday market snapshot for the Ottawa real estate market for Monday, October 14th, 2024. Here we are halfway through October on a long weekend for Thanksgiving, and let's see what's happening because the long weekends do affect things both ahead of and following the actual long weekends. My name is Annalie Rice. Every week I bring you the details of what's going on in the Ottawa real estate market. So let's see what's happening today. Citywide, we have a bit of a mix. So we see that the active listings are down by just shy of 40 across the city, but mostly that's the detached in the towns. You see those are quite significantly down. The condos are actually up. The number of active listings for condos are up this week. For the sales, we actually had a jump by 23 sales this week. We're at 240 sales, and those were mostly in the condos and then the townhomes, a drop actually for detached sales this last week. Okay, this is the visual breakdown of all the inventory. You can see the overall inventory in the black and the active inventory in the green. You can see that our levels of inventory have been elevated since the late spring, and we are just a week away from where the peak inventory was last year. That's the earlier peak halfway through the chart. And then we do expect that there'll be a drop off of inventory as the fall progresses. People just take the properties off and wait for spring. Down at the bottom, you can see the sales, the firm sales in red and the conditional sales in yellow. And I've got the little horizontal line there, and you can see that there's a gap between where our sales are and sort of where they've been at throughout the last little while compared to last year. So sales are definitely higher this year than last, which shows up in our monthly and overall stats when we do the wider view. Okay, so for new listings this week, we had 300 properties that came to the market. 115 of those properties were relisted properties. That's the gray line at the bottom. And we had 265 properties that were new to the market, and that's the blue line. The little horizontal lines are lined up with this week's listings, sales, new listings, and I don't have one for the relisted properties, but you can see that compared to last year, if you follow that line across to the vertical line that's sort of halfway across the chart, you can see that our new listings are lower than what they were the same week last week. I do want to point out one thing is that the Thanksgiving weekend last year was a week ago, like it was on the 9th of October. So you can see that last year there was a little bit of a jump up, and so that was the week following Thanksgiving. So our numbers actually kind of match a little bit closer to the same Thanksgiving weekend last year. But the biggest difference there is you can see the sales. You can see the sales that we've been at and that we're at this week are much, much higher. You'd have to go all the way back to June of last year to have sales at the same volume as we had this last week. So we're having pretty good sales throughout this fall market. Last year, the fall market was very short-lived with that one little hump just around October there. With 240 sales this week, that's a good number of sales for fall market. We had 14% of those sales were with no conditions, and obviously that's a drop off. The numbers are quite messed up when you're right around a long weekend. A lot of stuff gets sort of pushed to be finished or finalized right before the long weekend. There are fewer new listings right before a long weekend because people don't want to be having showings during a long weekend. And then as a result, you end up with sales like next week, we're going to have a drop in sales. So these numbers end up being a little bit skewed. So don't read a whole lot into these percentages and such. But for this week, we had 14% of the sales with no conditions, which is a drop. And we also had 14% of the properties that sold this week at or above asking price. And that is a huge drop. We're typically up closer around the 25-30%. For the sales within the first 7 days, it only represented 6% of the sales, 14 properties, and 57% of those were with no conditions, as well as 57% being above asking price. Sales within the first 30 days represented 44% of the sales. That was 106 properties, and 16% of those were with no conditions, and 25% were at or above asking price. Again, a lot of these percentages and stuff changed quite significantly from last week, but it's going to take a couple weeks around the long weekend for things to get sorted out and see where we're actually at through the fall market. So for the properties that sold at or above asking, we only had 34 homes this week that sold at or above asking, when past weeks we've been up around the 50, 60 or so properties. 19 of those homes, which was 56%, sold at asking or up to 1% over asking. 10 homes, which was 29% of the sales, sold between 1 and 5% over asking. And then we had 5 homes that sold for more than 5% of the asking price, and that represented 15% of those 34 homes sales. Of the 5 that sold for more than 5% of their asking price, 3 of them were set up for offer date and time. For the highest percentage over, it was 17% over asking, and it was also the same for the dollar amount over, and it was $125,000 over asking. It was a 3-bedroom detached home in Centertown. It was listed and sold for land value, so there's not much to say on that. They picked a price. It was listed at $725,000 and it sold for $850,000. Next, we'll look at the different areas of the city and see how the inventory and sales levels are going. Okay, central urban region, which is inside the Greenbelt, we have a drop in the inventory for detached in towns, and condos had a bit of a jump in the number of active listings. Sales were pretty steady for detached in towns, just up 1 and down 2, and then condo sales were higher this week with a +9. In Canada and Stittsville, we're still sitting at 200 active detached homes on the market, which I feel is pretty high for this time of year. And townhomes are sitting at 125, down 11, but still fairly high number of townhomes for sale in Canada and Stittsville. Condos, not much change, sitting at 42. The sales in the last week were up across the property types, just slightly for detached, up a little bit for townhomes there at 17 sales, and bounce back up to 5 condo sales this past week. In Barrhaven and Riverside South, we have an increase to the number of detached in towns on the market and a slight decrease for condos. And if you compare that, 125 for sale in Canada and Stittsville, and then only 87 right now for Barrhaven and Riverside South. So the inventory has come down a lot in Barrhaven and Riverside South for townhomes. Sales in the last 7 days, we had a drop for the detached, very slow sales this past week for detached homes in Barrhaven and Riverside South. Fairly good sales for townhomes, up at 14, and then just 3 condos sold in the last week for Barrhaven and Riverside South. And finally, in Orleans, we have a drop in the number of detached and towns on the market, and quite a bit of a jump there in condos, up to 59 condos for sale in Orleans this week. For sales, this slight drop for detached, townhomes, a bit of a jump there, up to 11. Although 4 would have been really low last week. And then condos actually saw a jump as well, 9 condo sales this past week. These charts show you the full data. You can look at the active days on market, number of conditionally sold and sold. And I do want to point out that we do expect a drop in the number of sales next week, just because there's fewer properties that were listed this past week, a lot less people out shopping this past week, people enjoying the long weekend, and then they may get back to it next week, but we'll have sort of a bit of a shorter week. This is the same data for the townhomes. Again, you can see that the number of conditionally sold properties is significantly lower than what has sold this past week. So sales were high this week, conditional sales low. So again, we'll see a drop next week. And finally, the same data for the condos, and the difference of the conditionally sold to sold isn't quite so obvious. There's actually more conditionally sold properties than there are sold this last week, but condos tend to have a longer conditional period, so we will see a bit of a blip, but it'll just be a little bit more delayed than what you see in the detached or townhome markets. And that's the update for this week. I hope you're enjoying your long weekend, and if you have any questions or comments, please get in touch. Let me know if you're enjoying the updates, and if you ever have suggestions, please put them in the comments, and I'd love to be able to answer questions or provide you info that you're looking for. Have a great week.